Last month I talked about some techniques that I'd forgotten about, and one of them was using background stamps. I used a brand new Hero Arts background in that video, and I loved it so much, I knew I wanted to make some more cards. So here's a 3-for-1 design that you can do with any background you want to use. A stamp, a gel print, pattern paper, or even solid color cardstock. I'm starting by stamping that same Acanthus cling stamp onto some white cardstock. If you remember last time, I stamped it in my MISTI without removing my sticky mat, and I found it a little tight, maybe adding too much pressure to the hinges. So I thought this time I would try it in my stamp wheel. This time I'm stamping it down with embossing ink so I can emboss with gold powder. So I started with some anti-static powder before inking up the stamp a couple of times and pressing it down. Now this is definitely thicker than using a clear stamp on the stamp wheel, but I was still able to easily get the wheel to lock into place, and I don't feel like I'm going to do any damage to it in any way. So I feel like this is a better way to stamp a cling stamp when I'm feeling lazy about taking the sticky mat out of my MISTI. My next step was to pour some gold embossing powder over top of the stamping, and you can see that I'm pretty awkward about it. I guess heat embossing was another technique that I should have included in that Forgotten Techniques video. To be honest, I rarely heat emboss in the summer, so hopefully now that it's cooler, I'll get some more practice. Once I finally got that panel coated with the powder, I put it into my foil-lined shoebox lid to heat it up. This box is genius. It keeps my fingers safe, and it really works well to reduce warping. But again, I'm showing how out of practice I am because I really didn't let the heat gun heat up properly, so it took me longer than it should have. Okay, let's just move on from that. That's embarrassing. Embarrassing or not, I ended up with a very elegant panel, and my next step was to add some ink blending to it. I grabbed 3 colors of green ink, Lime Rickey, Grass Skirt, and Deck the Halls. I started with the lightest, the Lime Rickey, and I blended all around my panel, letting my pressure lighten as I came to the center. I'm using my rotating platform with a sticky mat, and I have to say this combination is probably my #1 purchase this year. Being able to turn the cardstock quickly to keep the position of my ink blending hand comfortable has really been a game changer for my ink blending. I moved on to Grass Skirt, again coming in at the edges, but not going quite as far as the Lime Rickey. And finally, I added the Deck the Halls right at the very edges. This is a really deep green, and I'm getting a good contrast and a really rich look. And to finish it off, I just ran a cloth over it all to pick up any ink that might still be sitting on top of the gold embossing. Okay, so now after all that work, I want to maximize the number of cards I'm making. So I planned for a 2-for-1 design. I know, I said 3-for-1 earlier, but the third one was actually a bit of a surprise. So let me show you how it went. The key to this 2-for-1 is to use a word die with a shadow. I colored a panel with some of the Deck the Halls ink, and then while that was drying, I cut the shadow and the word from the embossed and blended panel. So I've got the word, and I've got the outline from around the word created with the shadow die. And of course I have the green panel. I trimmed that one down with a rectangle die to create an outside frame and then an inner panel, and you'll see what that looks like in a second. Then I cut the word from the dark green panel. So here's the plan for my 2-for-1. It's not quite coming all together on that second card just yet, but I started with the gold one on the right. I added some more Deck the Halls ink to the outside frame piece to add even more contrast, and also because I lost about 1/8 of an inch all around when I trimmed it down, which is where most of the darkest color was. And I added some more of the Grass Skirt ink to the edges of the inner panel, using a smaller brush, and then I came back in with some more Lime Rickey and the bigger brush to really use that contrast to create the look of a glow in the center. Now this joy word is really pale because it was cut from the center of the panel, and I wanted to add some of the darker ink to the edges to give it a bit more definition. And I grabbed one of these really small blending brushes from Waffle Flower to give me some control to keep the ink just on the edges. It looks like a lot right now because you're seeing the ink on the sticky mat, but once I was done, I was much happier with it. I decided to create a full dark green panel for this one, and I put down Deck the Halls ink all over it. When you do this, you don't need to worry about making sure it's 100% smooth. It'll smooth out and dry back a little over time. The fact that these inks are dye-based means that the cardstock gets quite wet when you do this, and it affects the texture of the smooth cardstock and gives it almost a velvety look, which is really rich. I grabbed one of the new Eyelet rectangle dies from Pretty Pink Posh to add some details to the panel. Because it was still a bit wet, all the little pieces stayed in the cardstock, which I was actually happy about. It's much easier to pop them out of the die cut rather than out of the die. At least I find that. Next, I added some gold splatter to these dark green elements. I'm sure you noticed that I didn't have the dot for the J in there initially, but I didn't. So I just went on my merry way, adding the pretty metallic splatter all over. And then when I did find the dot and put it in there, I couldn't actually seem to get any splatter on it. So I grabbed my aqua brush and I just added it myself. Okay, so now let's assemble this one. I've got a white card base and that outer frame. Working with narrow frames like this can be a little tricky. They can kind of bend and stretch if you're not careful. I put the glue on the back and then try to get the bottom 2 corners in the right place before pressing the top 2 corners in place and making sure the sides are straight. Then I put the glue on the back of the inner panel, making sure to get it right up into those little pieces that might lift up. I let it dry for a few minutes while I worked on my main sentiment. One of my very best craft room habits is that I cut extras of my favorite words anytime I'm die cutting, and I keep them in plastic envelopes. So I almost always have extra white die cuts that I can use to add dimension by stacking them underneath a fancy top. I decided to use gold for this card instead of the dark green, and I found a gold one in my envelope, and only after I glued it all together, I noticed that it actually had a tiny piece missing from the top. Now probably no one would notice that if I wasn't stacking it up with white behind it, but it looked pretty obvious to me. So I peeled that one back and I cut a new one from Inca Gold cardstock, added it to my stack, and then glued it to the card. I can use the damaged one to cut some dots for embellishments for future cards. I stacked up the dot as well, and I put an acrylic block on top to hold everything in place while the glue set. Okay, so card number 2, another white card base, and this time that dark green panel. I added glue to the back, but not underneath the scallops where the holes are. I didn't want any glue seeping out to the front. And then I next thought about my shadow. My original plan was to use the white shadow, but maybe a gold one would be better. But oh boy, I didn't get a clean cut on that one. Actually, it wasn't a cutting issue, but because of the way I pulled the die cut out of the panel, it seemed to pull some of the gold layer away from the backing layer. So I did it again, and after all that, I decided I liked the white better. What do you think? And I can just keep that extra shadow in the pocket for a future card. This time I decided to stack up the shadow cut rather than the word, and only 2 layers, because by the time I add the green joy on top and the panel underneath, there's quite a lot of layers on this card. Now I don't know about you, but I was finding it hard to leave these cards just green. I was craving some red. So I grabbed my cherry red pearls from Pretty Pink Posh, and it was easy to add them to what I'll call the gold card. They just add a nice pop of festive color. But with the darker card, they really disappeared on that deep background, so I added them in the white areas closer to the word. So here they are, my original 2-for-1, with some slight detours along the way, but I'm pretty happy with both of those. I think they look festive and classic, and yet still modern. And as I was cleaning up, look what I had left over. Well, those pieces are just begging to be my 3rd card, don't you think? I added glue all over the white shadow right to the edge because that embossed outline, which is the result of cutting the word from the center of the shadow, it's pretty narrow, and I want to be sure it's really stuck down. I added the dark green joy to the center, and then the gold center to the O, and finally the dot. And now I need a background panel. Well, I'd kind of been wishing that I had stamped tone on tone onto the dark green panel, so I decided to stamp a white panel with the dark green ink. I got my stamp wheel out again, inked up the stamp, and pressed it down a couple of times. Oh my goodness, I love this stamp. I mean, just look at it. Okay, so that looks pretty nice, but I was still seeing that tone-on-tone look in my mind. So I added some dark green blending around the edges, and then some of my mid-tone a little further in. So this isn't quite tone-on-tone, but it is monochromatic, and it's also pretty dramatic. I added some splatter, and I think this is looking pretty magical. This time for my pop of red, I decided to add a narrow red mat around the green panel, which I had cut down. I used my rouge ink and swinked it around the edges. I added the panel and then put it all onto a white card base. This one might actually be my favorite. I think it looks like a fairy tale. The splatter looks like snow and there is such a beautiful glow. Which one do you like best? Now just before you go, I've got a couple of bonus ideas for backgrounds. First, what do you do if you don't have a background stamp? It's so easy to create backgrounds with so many other crafty goodies we already have. Let's start with a small stamp. Here's a little Christmas tree. And you can stamp it randomly to create a background, but here's a stencil with a grid of circles. This grid is going to make placement of my trees a total breeze. But not only that, it allows me to use multiple colors, which would be much more difficult if I had one big stamp with lots of little trees on it. There's a little wiggle room in these circles, which means that your pattern may not be like mathematically precise, but it also allows for turning the stamp a little if you wanted to do that with, say, a heart or a star or something else. I want my trees as straight as possible. Now, if you don't have a grid stencil like this one, you could just eyeball your placement, or you could draw a grid on your card panel in pencil and erase it later, but only after you're sure your ink is totally dry. I worked through my colors in a pattern, but knowing I wanted less red and more green. So when I got to the last one, I did every other one in green before finally filling in the very last ones with my red ink. This is an easy way to kind of break up the pattern for what your brain is expecting and making that red a little more special. Isn't it fun? This set has an even smaller solid star stamp, and I grabbed some yellow ink and I added the star just to the blue trees. Not putting it on every tree is another way of kind of breaking up that pattern from what you might expect. Now in the end, that left column of just green trees seemed a little bit out of place, so I trimmed it off and made my panel a little smaller. And here's another fun way to add big interest in a small way with a background stamp. My sentiment will be this Mary die cut, and I've coated it with the lime Rickey ink. It looks dark right now, doesn't it? My lime Rickey is pretty fresh, and it will dry back. Now to jazz this up a little bit, I've got this clear background stamp from Altenew, Pinstripes. It's an oldie, but it's a classic, and I'm not even going to take it off the acetate sheet. I actually find clear background stamps can be tricky to work with, but I just need a little bit of it. So I pulled back the acetate, inked up just a portion of the stamp, and then I pressed the die cut into it. I used a piece of scrap paper to keep my hands clean and make sure I got a good impression all over. One thing about this method, I'm not going to get another chance to stamp it. Now I'm getting a retro, almost mid-century feel from this pattern, and I know I want it on a white card base, but I'd like a little more definition. Instead of adding a mat, I grabbed that Deck the Halls ink and I just kind of carefully pushed each edge into it. You don't want to push hard enough that you cut into the ink pad, just enough to stain the edges of the cardstock. Perfect. To finish this one, I stamped a Christmas word on the panel and I assembled the card. See how that dark edge just adds a little definition that ties in with the stripes on the die cut sentiment? I could go on a lot longer about different ways that you can use background stamps. In fact, I've got a video right here from a few years ago, back when these versatile craft room workhorses were closer to the top of my mind. So if you're looking for more ways to use background stamps, I'll meet you over there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.